that should be good now. And when it switches, it should switch between us. Let's
And
try
that's
this
all
again.
the technical stuff out of the way.
You
Finally.
say that, but I guarantee there'll be another session in 10 minutes time.
Well, all right. So it's the first podcast. This is the pilot episode. It's going to be rubbish, as you've rather reluctantly made me come around and admit the first one is always rubbish. So we're in lockdown. 2 weeks in, we've got another 2 weeks. Most people seem to be following the rules. It's very tempting to maybe go out and try and flout them a little bit, but it appears to me that, you know, the great thing about this day and age is when people disobey, when you have something that the community is so on board with and that we understand it's so critical, enough of us do, that any dissent, any people who try and flaunt the rules will be shamed by, first on your social media, and may even end up being on the news for it. And it's a wonderful thing to see that the vast majority of New Zealanders understand the importance and are behaving themselves.
Kind of. It's a little bit interesting seeing it from the other side of the fence, because you look at particularly the gay community. Actually, somebody I was talking to earlier said I should probably bring that up. And there are a lot of people who are sitting around on things like Grindr and Tinder at the moment who are looking to go out and hook up with people in their sort of general area. Maybe 20-30% are sort of still actually doing that. I know people who have broken quarantine and gone out purely for sexual purposes. Maybe 60% sort of have things like stay home in the profile and why are you going out, what are you people doing? But there are people going out and doing it. And I don't get that personally, because how desperate do you have to be? Like, really, this is really bad.
I can imagine there'll be quite a lot of desperation going on. There were even jokes about, we're going to have a baby boom in 9 months.
I think we definitely are.
I would say there's going to be a second baby boom in 18 months, because that's when, oh no, what am I saying? At the end of the lockdown, that'll start a second one that'll come several weeks after the first, because that's when all the hormonal young teenagers are finally let out on the prowl again.
We're going to get one shortly. Somebody sent me a video the other day. What? Video? Photo of the supermarket. All the condoms and all the lube was sold out. And that was like the last thing they were doing shopping was picking up a few extra supplies and trying to get those things sort of collected together. And
well, at least they're leaving the toilet paper for everybody else.
What is everybody going to do with all the toilet paper? I mean, really?
The crazy thing was, and this is, I mean, that's the other side of it. Yes, from what I've seen, maybe it doesn't represent what's actually going on out there, but while people seem to be, in general, following the rules of the quarantine, that panic buying we saw at the very beginning was nuts. It was completely unjustified. I believe from the outset they were marking all of the people who worked in supply and logistics and things like that as essential services. We were never going to run out of supplies at the supermarket. And still, so many of these doomsdayers went out and practically just lost all control and all reason, and were indulging in panic buying. It was pretty bloody ridiculous, if you ask me.
And panic buying weird things too, like the whole run on toilet paper. I mean, seriously, you just don't need that much toilet paper. And there's lots of other things you could do if you really, really ran out and were desperately in need of something to use that.
Well, the symptoms of coronavirus did not involve needing a whole lot of toilet paper. It's simple as that.
For some reason, that's what people desperately decided that they needed, as opposed to long-term food storage and those kind of things to keep them going during that period if they couldn't get to supplies and things. And even then,
Some of it is just herd behaviour. Would have been a few people started, they grabbed some rolls and everything, and then, you know, it's an essential item, and yeah. Well, that's the other thing. I mean, they're particularly difficult for, if you were going to panic buy one thing, it's pretty difficult to grab a whole lot of them because they take up so much space.
I think it is that herd behavior that you've just referenced before. As in, somebody would have gone in there and seen that there was either a lack of stock of toilet paper, or that somebody else had a bunch of it in their shopping trolley, or they saw an online video about people buying it, or something like that. And then the next person took 5 rolls, and the next person took 10 and 20, and then the shelves were suddenly completely devoid of any stock of toilet paper because 3 people had bought it all. And that makes it look like to everybody else that there is some kind of shortage going on, when that's just not the case.
And then when you go on social media, and of course soon it goes viral, all these videos of people getting too much toilet paper, and on the one it sort of highlights how selfish and absurd they are behaving, but it would have also inspired an enormous number of other people who saw those videos to go out and panic. And fear of missing out, exactly.
Yep.
Doesn't just affect social situations.
And I've been out and done some shopping earlier this week just to stock up and sort of where I was at and keep a bit ahead of the curve. And all the supermarkets had plenty of stuff in stock. There didn't appear any supply chain issues. There were plenty of people around. Yeah, there were lines and things, but it didn't take me that long to get through. And I found a few other places that are sort of a bit further down the supply chain that had no bit in them. And they had all the stock there, and it was fine. You just buy a little bit more in larger bulk. Places like Gilmore's or Davis Food Ingredients or the New World in Riviera was actually really good. The line there was maybe 5 people long and took me, I don't know, less than 10 minutes to get through the line. So there's no reason to panic or anything like that. The world's not falling
absolutely
apart.
fine. We were going to New World in Glenave and Mount Wellington, and same story. You know, staff were friendly, everyone was friendly. They weren't tolerating any sort of anyone trying to panic buy anything or be aggressive. And yeah, it was all, you know, a bit of a line outside, but otherwise it was just as per normal. It is early days though. Could it get worse? I mean,
Yes.
4 lockdown, and we've already seen the memes coming out with the government says 4 weeks of lockdown, then it shows somebody holding those +4 Uno cards. And yes, this is a possibility. This could go on longer. You know, that's pretty clever, isn't it?
I thought that was quite clever, yes. And
it's great to see, even in this time of, you know, it's a global pandemic. It's a very dangerous situation. We have to lock down. We have to make massive and sometimes very stressful changes to our day-to-day lifestyle. But isn't it so great to see with the memes and all the jokes, and even at a time like this, we still have our sense of humor?
Do you think we actually have to lock down?
Yes.
Why?
Because it reduces social interaction, close social interaction, and therefore, just as we've been told by the World Health Organization and governments around the world, that is the best way to try and prevent the virus from spreading.
True. There's been quite a few people out there. I don't really count myself as one of them because I think probably a bit of a lockdown is kind of necessary, despite my aversion to it in general. But it stops the spread of the virus, but it's not really going to resolve the problem. The entire point of the lockdown is not to end the viral infection or to stop it spreading around people entirely. It is to reduce the rate at which it spreads to the population, so that in the event that people who catch it need to be hospitalized, that they'll actually have a hospital bed to get into. Because if it spreads too quickly, you infect the population too fast, you'll just find your hospital, your healthcare system is completely overwhelmed by the rate at which people are getting infected and need to be hospitalized. So would we be better or worse off if we didn't have a lockdown? I think the evidence is definitely in favor of it is better to have the lockdown, at least for the moment, at least for a short period of time, to slow the rate. In the grand scheme of things, is it going to prevent most of the population from getting this virus? No, probably not. Almost everyone will get it eventually. It has a very high infection rate. We're just trying to stem the flow. It's like if the dam bursts and you're trying to put a temporary dam in place and then use the spillway to release the water at a more reasonable rate down the side so that you don't overwhelm the river that's down below and wash out the whole town. So, yeah, that's where I sort of sit on that.
Well,
It's
I hate to
necessary.
say it, but that's basically it's where that is where things look like they're going to be heading. We had, I mean, closing the borders of countries, lockdowns. In this day and age, with the just-in-time sort of deliveries and globalization and indeed the global supply chain, such things are barely workable. They're barely workable even temporary. 4 weeks of a lockdown in New Zealand, that's going to devastate our economy. It already has. We know it. There's no real way around that. I know over in Australia, Scott Morrison had what I thought was a very well-intentioned, a very good idea, but possibly one that isn't workable. What he was saying is we need to hibernate all the economy and the industry. So basically, say you have a business that it's going to, if you lock the population down for 4 weeks and nobody can go and buy anything, what you have to do is you have to cut off their rates, their utilities, their expenses, and allow them somehow to keep staying in business even though they're not getting any income. You may be able to do that for 4 weeks. You may be able to do that for 3 months, but anything longer than that, it's untenable. The landlords need to be paid. The businesses cannot survive on welfare like that. We wouldn't be able to subsidize them. And while this will be a very, very serious and even a very a debate about ethics more than anything else, that at what point do we give up? At what point is it reasonable and prudent to give up trying to contain it and accept the fact that, yes, we will all probably get it. Eventually, we'll have some herd immunity, but at a massive cost in terms of the number of lives lost. Or failing that, could we conceivably lock down until a vaccine is made available, by which time the economy and indeed the world as we know it will be very, very different?
In answer to the last part, probably not. I don't think we'll be able to lock down long enough to have a vaccine developed and deployed in such a way that will be effective against this. We're sort of looking at like a year or 2 years to get something like that out. Anyway, just in vaccine development time, it takes a while. And you've got to make sure that it's actually going to be effective. It's not going to actually be worse than getting the virus in the first place. It's not going to go and cause more problems. And you don't want the situation where the cure is worse than the disease. But that's also the question in terms of the economics of the whole situation as well. If you were very harsh about it and have tried to work out the total economic value in loss of life compared to the total economic value in loss of the economy, where do you draw that line? At what point do you say that we would lose more value or gain more value from doing option A or option B? And this now plays into the opportunity cost of that decision. Is option A, where we lock down for at least a short period of time or in some kind of rolling block period, more or less costly than just letting things go.
It is completely incalculable, effectively, because we're not just looking at the monetary losses. You know, you have, or already we know that over the past, say, give or take 10 years at least in New Zealand, there have been massive problems with mental health, depression, anxiety, worrying about the future. We've got a lot of people under a whole lot of stress as it stands, and you know, to put them in lockdown, to take so many people out of work, and basically take away their hope and their livelihood, there is a massive price to pay in doing that in itself. I mean, I guess I can only look at it from what have I experienced. It's 2 weeks, and you know, I would work a hell of a lot, sort of 60 to 75 hours a week, and that was normal, and I enjoyed it. So going from working full time and more than that to 4 weeks of lockdown, it sounds great on paper. It sounds like you're going to get a holiday. It's been absolutely
Nightmarish.
Absolutely monotonous, and yes, I have struggled to maintain my sanity just for 2 weeks, and I cannot imagine how a lot of people, you know, if their livelihood and everything, and work and things like that, and a sense of purpose, how that is affected by being told for, you know, X number of weeks, we don't know how long it's going to be in total yet, all of that has to go on hold.
That probably is the worst aspect there, is the uncertainty of the whole situation. If we knew for a fact that it was going to be 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever, people can plan for that and have certainty about their future. But not knowing that information, having that uncertainty, and makes it very, very difficult for us to think about that. And I mean, very little has changed in my life. I'm working from home now at the moment anyway, so I'm just sort of keeping on like I have been anyway. But it is then the difference between having the liberty to leave your house and go and do things out in the wide open world and meet up with people or have people come around, and not being able to do that. And that is quite a bit of a difference to get used to. So it's certainly very weird.
Do we see an end to it?
Do I see an end to it? That will be an interesting question.
I'm mainly asking that because I don't.
I think it's going to take a lot longer than people think. I think we'll get to the end of the 4-week period and there'll be a reassessment of the general risk level and how many people have been infected, new cases, and those sorts of things, and how we have stemmed the tide a little bit, and then that will be the reassessment point. But it will also depend on how insane everybody is being cooped up at home, because that now has to be balanced against, if you make a lockdown indefinite and you restrict people's ability to do anything, there will come a certain point where the population will no longer put up with that. And now you have to contend with potential riots or violating quarantine anyway. And what becomes the greater cost?
Well, I was more thinking beyond the lockdown. So say this finishes, say we have to throw up our hands and say, look, we can't keep locking the country down. We have to try and go back to life as normal as we can risk it being, and take the cases of COVID-19 as they come. I'm trying to rationalize all of this. I believe that what's going to happen is that in future, the the world we knew, basically, prior to this global pandemic, and how vulnerable it was to such an occurrence happening, and in a way which it wasn't so vulnerable when you think of the economy, when you think about our way of life. It was not as vulnerable when the Spanish flu hit in 1918. You know, with globalization, with the supply chains and everything like that, we will need to reimagine society. That is, like you say, you've been working from home and everything. Well, first of all, lucky you. I'm envious because I wish I could do that. But the idea of working from home, that is going to need to supplant having an enormous number of people go to the same offices or places of work every day, every weekday. We will have to look at public gatherings, concerts, events, and things like that. And while we will still be able to hold them, everything we do and everywhere we gather and our understanding of it has to be basically built on the concept that another global pandemic could happen, and there's no choice. We will need to be ready to fight it. And the way we've been fighting this one and scrambling to try and contain this virus is nowhere near as good as we need that to be.
So there's probably a couple of aspects there, and I suppose it depends at which point in the chain of causality you actually want to interact. Particularly in the case of New Zealand, this could have been potentially averted if immediately on discovery of the information that there was a virus outbreak happening in China, all international travel was cancelled. You could nip it in the bud at that point and then not have to take any of these other more extreme steps afterwards. That's probably a more reasonable place to draw the line rather than preventing people gathering in any large numbers anywhere, because that's almost inevitably going to happen. So at which point do you think we should be drawing that line, and why?
Well, if you were going to, I happen to have just read recently an article about what actually happened in those first days of the coronavirus being discovered, and the transparency, or rather lack of transparency, between the Chinese administration and officials and the World Health Organization. So basically, the gist of it is that by the time we knew enough to be able to justify such a radical decision as closing the border, the virus had already taken hold. 175,000 citizens of Wuhan had already flown around the world, and some of them would have infected an enormous number of people, as we found out. And unless you were going to close the borders at the most vague, insignificant seeming the hint of a pandemic starting, there'd be no sense in doing it. It would be the boy who cried wolf.
Perhaps that's the right decision, because if you did it immediately and kept the borders closed for 2 weeks and didn't let anyone come into the country from any overseas destination for 2 weeks, there would only be a 2-week lockdown, which would technically be half as bad as a 4-week lockdown that we're in the moment. And you probably could capture most of those cases before they got here. So that would be an interesting point. But I think, as you correctly point out, it depends on a bit of openness and transparency from other world governments. You couldn't necessarily draw that line so early as to say, if you found, or the Chinese government found one person infected in one city at one point, one disease, if you draw the line there, you're probably drawing it far, far too early.
Certainly. And I suppose as sort of ethical debates will go on after this, virus prevention and pandemic prevention, this concerns all of mankind. Maybe you'd have an outbreak in a country who perhaps they have a regime that wants to save face and doesn't want to admit there's a problem. Well, there needs to be a global framework in place to ensure that the investigations of such events are fully non-partisan and independent, because at the end of the day, it concerns all of us. And if we want to continue with this world of globalization and all of the benefits it brings, we'd better get a handle on this sort of thing.
Do you think the World Health Organization is an appropriate body for that purpose?
I believe their conduct in this case has been very inadequate indeed.
I agree with that as well. I've seen a few people put out some information recently that the head of the World Health Organization was put there by the Chinese government. This is a little bit conspiratorial, but they spent a lot of money putting that guy in that place, and he refused to answer questions. He refused to say anything against the Chinese government. That's not a good look. That's not that impartiality that you're looking for. That's not that global response that you're looking for. And it really doesn't help anyone to have somebody respond that poorly to something of this importance.
Oh, no doubt. And even, even and people get so, we go to extremes and everything, conspiracies and things like that. But okay, so say he wasn't bought and paid off by the Chinese government. That doesn't absolutely guarantee he didn't have a vested financial interest in coming up with conclusions or influencing investigations in ways that would perhaps not make the Chinese government and officials seem so incompetent. It's the same as, seeing politicians who are slaves to their donors and the interest groups who pay for their campaigns. This practice goes back for as long as politics has existed, and like you say, we need to weed it out of
the same old story. Follow the money.
Exactly, certainly. And hopefully it will be followed and a few things will be found out, because as far as I'm concerned, the World Health Organization and their initial response to this, that needs to be brought under the microscope after this debacle has finished.
I think this probably leads into the point that I always make with these kind of things. The problem tends to be centralized power. And in all of these cases, as we're actually seeing in the US right at the moment, which is really very interesting and quite a good response to it, is the decentralization of responses and power. If you look at the US at the moment, Donald Trump is sitting there saying, look, I'm part of the federal government, we're the third tier back. So we need state and local governments to make decisions about what they want to do with respect to quarantine and what their response is first. And then the senators who control the state, they make the secondary decision if the local body is unable to come up with an appropriate response. And if they still need more help after that, then the federal government steps in and does so at the end. And the problem is always with centralizing power in the hands of a few at the top of a very high-peaked hierarchy. For example, the World Health Organization, where the guy at the top is distributing the information, is that response is slow and not always accurate and not always applicable to the various different areas in which you're trying to respond. So I would argue for decentralization of that kind of power as much as possible.
The problem with that is that I know the World Health Organization has failed in this admirably, but the idea of centralizing it all is that you can initiate a momentous response a lot faster than you could if you had to go through all these separate channels. And there was even a piece in the New Zealand Herald the other day which it basically explained that it's because of the way America works with the different state and local bodies and their regulations and and how it's all overseen, it is actually inherently deficient when it comes to getting something out there like a nationwide lockdown or responding in kind to a global pandemic. And that's
That is a
because
very accurate criticism.
And yeah, well, you have a look when you have these when you have these violent and oppressive regimes, fascism, communism, socialism, whatever you want, it must be said. And I know that the numbers are probably pure fantasy, but I'm sure when the Chinese did get onto quarantining the Wuhan province, and because they have these certain tools that are unavailable to a democracy like ours, they can do it with a level of ruthlessness and brutality that will cause people to bloody well listen to what they're told.
I'm not sure if you'd use the word listen. I mean, they did literally weld people inside their houses and leave them to die. Not such a huge fan of that side of things, if that is factually accurate. But that's what I hear. And there is a speed of response if you have a really sharply peaked hierarchy. There's no other way to sort of deal with that. That's why we see hierarchies in things like the military, so that they can respond quickly. So there's one person at the top who can issue orders and everybody else will follow them. Yeah, it's a little bit unquestioning. Yeah, it centralizes power in specific locations, but it's also necessary to respond in a fluid, in a very flexible way to an ever-evolving landscape, which this is. I think that is what we reserve emergency powers for. The entire point is that they exist for the emergency and only for the emergency. Unfortunately, if you grant people that kind of power, those people want to hold on to that power afterwards.
Well, there's an absolute litany of examples of said power not being rescinded after the threat was over, or perhaps redefining it to suggest that the threat will never be over and therefore it's justified keeping the restrictions in place and the new laws in place. The Patriot Act in America, which was signed into law shortly after the 9/11 attacks to combat terrorism, is a pretty good example. It was extended under Barack Obama, and I don't believe that it will be taken down anytime soon.
I think that is going to be a very interesting question. I am a little bit on the fence about it, but I kind of feel like Trump's actually going to prove me wrong. And I'd love it if he did. I'd love it if he had all these emergency war powers and the Patriot Act and I can't remember the other one. But if he used those really temporarily and then actually gave them up, that would be the first, last, and only example we've ever had of a leader actually doing that. And it would be completely amazing. I just also don't think it's going to happen. I've talked to plenty of people on the left side of things recently. It's like, look, Trump's doing exactly what we said he'd do. It's like, well, it certainly looks that way, doesn't it?
Yes, well, that's the thing. The man is very much an enigma, and well, that's a funny thing. Trump always manages to get himself into a discussion, doesn't he? Even if it's about coronavirus.
I think that's the whole point. He sort of discusses and just keeps things going and feels the pulse of the people around him and what's happening. And maybe says a few really inappropriate things and then says some appropriate things and sees what the general response is and then picks the one that makes him most popular because he's a populist.
So how do you feel about his response to the coronavirus?
I agree with probably a lot of the commentators at the moment. That was relatively poor to start with, and he was trying to sort of bolster hope in the nation so that the economy didn't collapse at the beginning. It could have been a little bit quicker. He maybe could have been a little bit more authoritarian about it and closed the borders and things a little bit faster than he did. But we also didn't know what that point was. So, what is it? 49 to 52% of the American population is on side with what he's doing at the moment. It's working for a given value of working. It could have been better, could have been worse. He says he wouldn't have done anything different. Okay, sure. It's very hard with hindsight to go back and rehash something that's already been done.
Well, when you look at all the other world leaders, can we find anybody out there who we think did a perfect or even a very good response?
Honestly, Jacinda, I am not a Labour fan at all, but New Zealand's response has been pretty good. She closed the borders relatively quickly. She did have to wait that initial period to sort of see what was going on, what was going to happen, what the information was. She didn't wait too long. Could it have been a week earlier? Sure. Everything could have been a week earlier. But have we got less infections in the US per head of population? Yep, probably. Our health system's probably better. The response in getting legislation out there to help people to pay their rent and keep their jobs and support business has been better and faster than the US has been, because we haven't been held up by the Democrats, because we've literally got our Democrats in charge. So yeah, I think New Zealand's response probably has been better. Did Italy and Spain respond better than the US? No, not at all.
Well, that goes without saying.
We're always on this little bit of a spectrum here, but New Zealand's response has been pretty good, all things considered. Very authoritarian, not such a huge fan of that, but it's probably going to achieve the desired effect, which is to stem the flow and make sure our health system does not get overwhelmed.
Yes, I am of the camp that it could have happened earlier than it did. Things were getting pretty serious a week before the lockdown began. At the same time, though, in New Zealand, as with basically all sort of world problems that one can think of, New Zealand does have some major advantages of distance and a smaller population to start with, and even plenty of rural areas. And in fact, I mean, we all know the statistic that Auckland, in terms of sort of how big it is population-wise, it doesn't even register. But geographically, if you count all of its boundaries from Waikato to the Bay of Plenty, to what's Northland. How the heck could I forget that?
Oh, Winston Peters wouldn't like you for that one.
Yeah, well, I don't like Winston Peters anyway. It is a larger city in terms of area than anywhere else, and with far less population density. So we do have several advantages that have helped New Zealand from the coronavirus pandemic so far.
That is true. Having much less people to deal with and having a very relatively centralized government sort of in the central country makes it way easier to deal with the kind of stuff. It'll be a matter of whether or not they give up these emergency powers sort of at the end of all of this. Well, is it a continuously evolving emergency? Yeah, probably. Are we going to be only locked down for 4 weeks? Probably not. It will sort of go into rolling blocks after that, I suspect, until such time as the population has had enough. And that's really the limiting factor. It's how much the population is willing to put up with this.
Or how much social disorder and disruption it's going to cause before we finally decide to pull the plug.
Yep, and just let everybody get infected and see what happens. It'll happen eventually, and there's probably nothing we can do about it. So I saw Tim did a very interesting video earlier today. It's like, this is not the apocalypse that we expected. And just in the last few years, there's been a lot of interest in apocalyptic type movies. And we have been primed to expect those kinds of apocalypses. And what we're getting is this weird viral apocalypse sort of thing that is but isn't really a thing that is happening to us now. And people just don't know what to do. They don't know how they're going to interact. They don't know how they're going to support them and their families and their futures and see what happens. So it's really kind of weird. It's not like we see in the movies. Not everybody's turned into zombies and running around and destroying everything. Our systems are still working.
It's not an enemy we can fight.
No, it's not. It's an invisible enemy. And that makes it really hard and really uncertain. It does bring everybody together, though.
It's anxiety. Yes, absolutely. The communal spirit that we've seen out and about has been fantastic, and that comes from the knowledge that yes, we are all in this together, and we all have to do our bit. And it goes back to the maintaining a sense of humor, and even just trying to maintain that normal existence. Was walking around in the neighbourhood a few days ago. I saw a young family playing cricket in the middle of the street. They'd set up the wickets in the middle of the road, and why not? And so then I go out for a jog around in the evening, and I thought, you know what? There are no cars around. I'm just going to start jogging in the middle of the road, and I did. And then I hear something behind me, and I turn around, and sure enough, another runner is coming up, jogging in the middle of the road. I mean, why wouldn't you? And we for all the stress and anxiety that it can cause, you also get this wonderful, almost it's basically that Kiwi ingenuity that comes out in all these unexpected ways, that people will make the best of a situation. Though these are the restrictions we have to work around. Well, we will work around them, and we'll try and keep going as best as we can.
I don't know. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Is the economic cost going to be too much for us to bear?
Well, I can't answer that. The reason I can't answer that is because not just because I have no idea, but because I can't even point to any historical reference points that that is even remotely comparable to what's going to happen. Well, unfortunately not. Since World War II, with globalization and the way the entire infrastructure of the world and its trade and its economy has been built up, it depends on being able to move people and goods and information freely over vast distances and between countries. This virus and the precautions we're having to take cuts that off completely. And if there's one thing that I think's almost a certainty, there will be a backlash against China for doing this.
I think it started.
Exactly, because it came from there. They were the ones who tried to cover it up with the help of whether intentional or just through ignorance and incompetence through the World Health Organization as well.
Chinese Health Organization?
Yeah. Hey, we do not peddle conspiracy theories. You're probably right, but
just a little bit for fun.
Okay. But this is, I wouldn't be surprised if we're seeing the end of the world as we know it, and this next, and without sounding too dramatic and everything, there's going to be a definite sort of, I know, here's a very vague sort of juxtaposition.
Just there, the World War II basically was the end of the world as everybody knew it at the time, and the world didn't end; it continued on, and there's a similarity there.
We're not going to prosper.
You don't think so?
No, I think because we'll have to be more efficient. We'll have to be more efficient, and we will,
Does
through
efficiency not
having to
breed
regulate.
prosperity?
Perhaps efficient's the wrong word. We're going to have to scale things down, is what I'm saying. We're going to have to put more regulations on, and that will make us unable to perform at the same level of efficiency as we did before. If there's
Okay.
one historical event I can look back at and think, well, the day the 1990s ended was September 11th, 2001. Everything was the same right up until then. The day the 2010s ended was when coronavirus was, I don't know. Well, there'll be a lot of debate, won't there? Well, when we finally realised it was getting out of control, because that's ultimately where the new sort of age and the new system began.
I think it is definitely going to disrupt globalization. And to be fair, I thought that was a bad idea to start with, but it's we're seeing it at the moment. It's the protectionist nation states, particularly the US and Europe and things, and all the Western countries actually pulling their manufacturing back to being local and in-house. Because as we're sort of seeing the reports come out at the moment, there were a lot of Chinese companies in Australia who instructed their employees to hoard all the medical supplies and send them back to China before the virus information was released. And I think everybody considers that to be quite inappropriate, and particularly if everybody else knew. That seems very subversive.
Oh, certainly, but a lot of what you're saying was happening anyway, and it's not just Trump doing it. He wouldn't exist. He wouldn't be in a position where he could try and reinvigorate American manufacturing and wean them off the influence of China.
That has always been his position.
Well, exactly. The point is he is in a position of power to be able to do that because an enormous number of people voted for him. And what we're seeing with populism all around the world, especially in Europe, is that there has been a resurgence of nationalism and pride in one's country. And like you say, it's a backlash against globalization, but it's also a return to what we know about nationalism, which is basically you take care of your own people and you take care of things yourself. And I think that will be very much part of the next phase that the world and the systems and the ideologies that we know goes through.
That does play into sort of a little bit what you're talking about with efficiency, because part of the way that we get efficiency is economy of scales and diversification of labor. And if we can't do that anymore, if we can't specialize out into our own specialities in each country, in each individual, in each community that you're in, because if you do, then you find that your supply chains lack in certain aspects, and you have to bring everything back in-house and have that very DIY attitude again, you lose a massive amount of efficiency in doing that. It's like trying to grow your own vegetables or your own meat products or farm in your own backyard. It's just not efficient. And that's going to have something that we get used to. But at what point do you draw that line? Do we all actually now have to start having vegetable gardens in our backyards? That's a really inefficient way of doing it, but is it now worth the trade-off?
Well, it's bizarre, really, because 6 months ago they were still paving over those backyards and building houses on them. But that's what I mean. The fact that we're discussing
Motoreka Kiwi dream, right?
Exactly. The fact that we're seriously considering, an end to everything we've known in a lot of ways, perhaps that is what we're going to have to do. And perhaps this globalization, which has brought so much wealth, brought so many people from all over the world out of poverty, and increased the wealth and GDP of so many nations, perhaps that needs to, perhaps it's shown to be not deficient inherently, but vulnerable.
I'll give you
And
vulnerable.
in a way that is unacceptable going forward.
I think that is a fair point. I think there is a certain amount that is acceptable, but the point at which it is at the moment has become provably unacceptable.
And yeah, that's pretty much all that I have to say on that.
Next.